entity that possessed enormous power, power that was cast aside for many millennia, has finally been reawakened in the form of a young man. Non-perverted, intelligent, vastly powerful Issei. Chapter 1. The Primordials, the first race of beings and deities to come into existence, predated the powerful entities known as the Titans and their descendants, the gods. Beings of pure elements with cosmic attributes, the primordials formed the absolute fabric of the universe, representing the very aspects of nature. Ether, the personification of light, and Ankh, the personification of necessity. Chaos, the personification of the void, Chronos, the personification of time. Erebeus, the personification of darkness, Eros, the personification of desire. Gaia, the personification of the earth, Hemera, the personification of the day. Hydros, the personification of primordial waters, Nesoi, the personification of islands. Nyx, the personification of the night, Ophion, the personification of serpents, Areia, the personification of mountains, Phanes, the personification of procreation, Pontus, the personification of water, Tartarus, the personification of torment, Thalassa, the personification of the sea, Thesis, the personification of creation, and Uranus, the personification of the sky, were the center of the primordial deities. Astronomical in size, and possessing vast prodigious strength, along with cosmic elemental divine powers, they were easily predated to be the absolute strongest entities in the universe. However, contributing to their mighty strength, a vast outbreak formed between the primordial gods themselves. The war was so climatic and massive, that it had caused numerous of natural disasters to exist throughout the world. Realizing that the near destruction of the world was caused from their own conflicts, the primordial gods combined all of their powers, amalgamating into one single supreme being. This almighty being, possessing all of the powers of the primordial gods, harbored a tremendous and monumental amount of power, far surpassing that of its many fusees. Deriving its powers from the original primordial gods, the new entity reanimated the world, freeing it from the damages its many fusees had caused. With its power, the entity had managed to regenerate the world back to its original state. As time went by, the entity spawned the secondary powerful beings known as the Titans, and following them, the gods. After so many years of its existence, and its confidence that the world would be safe, the fused entity voluntarily chose to fade into existence, its passing creating new formed natural landscapes, and new lands and seas. Its colossal power, however, was not passed on, and continued to flow endlessly throughout the universe as time went on, waiting until it was needed again. Many millennia later, in a large-sized hospital, the piercing scream of a woman giving childbirth could be heard. "Push. You can do it. Come on, Mrs. Hyodo, you can do it." Mrs. Hyodo, encouraged by her doctor's words, began to push, feeling her baby emerging out of her womb. Mrs. Hyodo had short brown hair with warm yellow-brown eyes. Her eyes were shut tight in pain. Ah. Her husband, Mr. Hyodo, stood by her, wincing in pain as his wife gripped his hand none too softly. The Hyodo male had brown hair, and brown eyes covered by glasses. "It's okay, ow. Honey. You're doing great. Just keep pushing." Mrs. Hyodo gave a final push, and the doctor smiled, holding the baby in front of the couple. "It's a boy." The couple smiled in happiness, kissing each other. The doctor wrapped the newborn, and handed him to his parents, the Hyodouses themselves smiling in adoration. Mrs. Hyodo happily accepted her son, cradling him in her arms. The newborn had brown hair, inherited from his father, and his fluttering eyes were a warm brown color, like his mother's eyes. Mrs. Hyodo noticed the size of her son, and tilted her head, looking at her husband. "He's so small, honey," she said. "Almost like a plush toy." Mr. Hyodo raised an amused eyebrow, and looked at his son with a smile. "Well, I'm sure in no time, he'll be just as tall as me." The newborn Hyodo closed his eyes, sleeping quietly in his mother's embrace. The Hyodo couple grinned at each other. Mrs. Hyodo gushed. "Honey, what should we name him?" Mr. Hyodo peered at his newborn son with a curious expression. He put his hand under his chin, and scratched it. Then a thought came to him, and he smiled. "Issei." Mrs. Hyodo looked up in surprise at her husband, who grinned sheepishly at her. "It was my great-grandfather's name.
His wife smiled warmly, and she looked back down to their sleeping son. Yes. I love it. She kissed the newly named Issei on the forehead, and embraced him much more softly towards her. Issei. My special little Issei. Note. Don't worry, I'm still going to focus on my other stories. It was just that this idea came to me, and I felt compelled to write it. Sorry if I keep jumping around stories. The alternate ideas just seem interesting to me. Anyway, have a good day. Ch1 of 13 next chapter 2. Mr. and Mrs. Hyodo knew their son was special and exceptional in his own way. But there was something off about Issei. He seemed to exude an otherworldly aura about him. As Issei grew older, his parents began to notice a great change within their son. When Issei was 5 years old, his body began to go through a great change. Much to the shock of Mr. and Mrs. Hyodo, they noticed that Issei had developed superpowered capabilities. One incident had occurred, involving Issei's enhanced super hearing. Issei and his parents were invited to a friend's cookout, and all of the noisy children, and the music all manifested at once. His super hearing causing him to be susceptible to the loud noise, Issei clutched his ears in pain, and ran back into the host's house, looking around to find somewhere to hide.
To his relief, he found a closet, and eagerly entered it, closing it behind him. He closed his ears tightly, struggling to cancel out the noise. Mrs. Hyodo, catching sight of her son running away, went to chase after him. When she went inside the host's house, she could hear whimpering from a nearby closet. Her eyes softened as she went over to the closet. Issei. The response was another whimper from Issei, and she heard a cry from her son. Mommy. Mrs. Hyodo frowned in great worry for her son. Issei. It's all right. Mommy's here. Another soft whimper was uttered from Issei, increasing the concern of his mother. Okazen. Issei began. Everything's too loud. And the noise won't stop. Torn by her son's pain, Mrs. Hyodo lowered her voice softly, verbally reaching for her son. Then let it be silent. Focus on my voice, eyes. Imagine you're on a large mountain, the ocean's waters clashing onto the rocks. Can you imagine it, honey? Her son's breathing was slowing, taking deep breaths. Mrs. Hyodo smiled warmly. Do you see it, eyes? Inside the closet, Issei seemed to be recovering. The piercing echoes of the sounds he had experienced were starting to fade, indicating he was now in control of his super hearing. His hearing healed, he slowly opened the door, the first sight being his mother, who smiled softly. Issei sniffled and rubbed his eyes, his mother patting his head gently. I see it, mommy. Mrs. Hyodo wrapped her arms around her son, embracing him tightly. Issei accepted his mother's embrace, feeling safer within her grasp. 2 years later, their field trip ended, the elementary students crowded back on the traveling school bus. As students crowded on, a 7-year-old Issei stood nervously, being the last person in line. He quietly walked in after the students, and immediately upon entering the bus, he looked around, trying to look for a seat. His soft brown eyes appeared downcast in sadness, until he saw an empty seat. His hope flared. Issei walked over to the seat, and stopped in surprise when he saw a person already occupying a seat. It was a girl sitting alone all by herself. She had long dark brown hair that swept all the way down to her back, and a fringe swept to one side of her face. Her skin was pale, and she had stoic brown eyes. The girl was clad in a red turtleneck, and dark blue jeans. She was holding a novel in her hand. Noticing the curious look Issei was giving her, the girl gave him an almost cold look. Issei, his nervousness now increased at the girl's cool gaze, looked down in shyness. Is that seat taken? He pointed to the large leftover space on the seat, between the girl. The girl didn't say anything, and was about to speak until a voice interrupted her. Hey look, Weird Sei has a crush on Naomi. Issei looked up, and to the left to see one of the bullies who often harassed him. Issei pouted, while the bully smirked nastily at him. No, I was just. But his words were cut off, when the whole crowd of kids were singing. Weird Sei and Naomi, sitting in a tree, kissing. Issei glared at the kids, while the girl, her name revealed as Naomi, glared darkly at the kids ridiculing her. Issei turned back to Naomi with an apologetic look, while the girl just stared coldly at him. With a sigh, she scooted away, so Issei could squeeze into the seat. It was going to be a long trip back to the students' school, so Issei chose to rest, closing his eyes in peace. Naomi glanced at her seatmate, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. As she peered at Issei, her usual stoic brown eyes softened slightly. Naomi usually appeared to be a lonely child at times. None of the students ever interacted with her, and nor did she ever interact with any of them. It was never a matter of whether or not she was nervous to meet someone new. She simply never had the desire to do so. All of the kids that went to the school annoyed her greatly. Except Issei Hyodo. Her eyes widened as a memory came to her mind. Flashback. At the school playground, the kids were happily playing. Some kids occupied themselves with the swings, monkey bars, and slides. Naomi Rin, however, sat down on the bench, engrossed in her reading. She looked up at the kids with an emotionless expression. As she looked around her surroundings, she noticed a young boy with short brown hair and soft brown eyes looking forlornly at the kids enjoying themselves. The child occupied himself by playing in the sandbox, the sand getting into his hair. Naomi kept her cool gaze upon the young boy. She felt something touching her hand, and she abruptly looked up to see a hefty-weighted young male with a nasty grin. His eyes glinted dangerously towards Naomi. "Whatcha reading, Naomi?" Naomi glared darkly, and she gripped her book tightly, enclosing it in her arms. "None of your business. Now leave me alone." Unfortunately, the boy ignored her request, and promptly snatched Naomi's book from her harshly. Naomi looked at the boy in angered shock, and she reached up to grab the book from him. The boy pushed her down onto the ground, causing her to yelp in surprise and pain. Oh, Issei Hyodo, hearing a sound of discomfort, looked over to the direction where Naomi and the boy were. His soft brown eyes narrowed, and he got up from the sandbox. After shaking the sand off of him, Issei walked over their direction. The bully smirked as he lifted the book greatly over Naomi's reach. Naomi grunted as she jumped up, trying to reach for her book. "Give her book back." Surprised at the voice, the bully looked behind him to see Issei glaring up at him with a serious expression. Naomi gave her apparent savior a shocked look, while the bully smirked. "Weird say, mind your own business." He turned back around, until Issei spoke yet again, this time with an angry edge. "I said, give it back to her." The bully rolled his eyes, and he turned around to look at Issei. He smiled evilly. "And just who's gonna make me, you, weird say?" "Yeah right." He laughed annoyingly, furthering Issei's rage. Naomi glared up at the bully, but then she looked up at the sky. The sky was getting darker. Her eyes widening in shock, Naomi clutched her throat, trying to catch her breath. Looking around her, her eyes widened even further, as she noticed something different about Issei. His body was covered in a large aura. The aura entirely surrounded Issei's body, seemingly increasing in size. Naomi looked on in shock, and she looked up at the bully who stepped back. What's with you weird say?" Issei didn't respond, the aura increasing greatly. Naomi struggled to breathe, a feeling of suffocation beginning to arise in the air. The aura around suddenly formed into a sphere-shaped barrier that encased Issei within. The bully took a few steps back, trying to hide his fear. "Q quit it, weird say." That was the last straw, as Issei's pupils constricted, and he emitted a bellow. As he screamed, an immense surge of vast energy covered the air. Naomi, unfamiliar with the new sense, could only grip the bench, trying to regain her balance. The bully, however, was not so lucky, and was overcome by the pressure of the vast energy sent by Issei. The bully was flown far away, causing him to drop Naomi's book, and he ended up crashing into a bush. All of a sudden, the suffocating flux of energy had faded away, the sky returning to normal. The breeze finally calming down, Issei's aura began to disappear, before being reabsorbed into his body. Naomi, regaining her balance, looked on in astonishment at Issei, who seemed to have calmed down. His head shot up, and he walked away from Naomi. Naomi followed her savior's direction with wide eyes, until she could no longer see him. Here, Naomi jumped in shock, and she turned around to see Issei holding her book in front of her. Her brown eyes gazing at him, she slowly retrieved her book from him. The calm Issei gave her a gentle nod. Issei. Issei turned around to see his mother. A cheerful smile grew on his face, and he rushed towards her, hugging her in happiness. Naomi stood shell-shocked, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. End of flashback. Naomi looked at the sleeping Issei with an almost downcast look on her face. I never did thank him for doing that. She tilted her head, and she reached to touch Issei's shoulder, with the intention to wake him up. But she hesitated, before retreating her hand. She decided to let him sleep. Issei was silently breathing in and out as he slept peacefully. Issei's dream. 19 beings that were astronomical in size, fought endlessly with each other. The beings appeared to be in a war, as the area around them began to deteriorate as a result. A series of natural disasters began to occur. Tornadoes, hurricanes, and tsunamis decimated the area around the world. The 19 beings suddenly ceased in their war, and they individually looked around in their surroundings. As they peered about, an aura surrounded the 19 beings, and they began to pull towards each other, and a bright flash covered the area, imploding in its wake. A new being emerged, and with a wave of its hand, pieces of the world began to reform, the area around it regenerating back to its unharmed state. End of Issei's dream. Issei's eyes shot open, and he jumped up in shock. Naomi looked at him curiously, raising an eyebrow in confusion. Issei was breathing heavily, his heart racing rapidly. Naomi, unfamiliar on how to comfort others, attempted to place her hand upon him, until there was a crash that shook the bus. The bus trailed across the bridge, crashing into a river. The bus turned upside down, causing the occupants to turn over in the bus. The students gripped their seats, however, Issei was not so lucky. When the bus turned over, Issei was flown back, and he was ejected out of the window, falling deep into the river. Naomi, the only one who had witnessed this, hurriedly tried to reach for Issei's hand before he was flown back. The students screamed in terror, as the bus continued to sink into the river. The water flowed into the window, passing into the bus. The bus overflowed with water, almost suffocating the students. They struggled to rise up to the surface, preventing the water from reaching them. Naomi breathed harshly, looking through the window frantically for Issei. But he was nowhere to be seen. Just then, before the bus could sink deeper into the river, it was suddenly lifted up. With the students unable to see him, Issei, putting his enhanced strength to use, lifted the bus up to safely. He placed it down on the river bank. The students, relieved that they were alive, cheered, and then they stopped when they saw a drenched Issei regaining his breath. Recovering from her seat, Naomi peered up and her brown eyes widened in shock. He's alive. He's really alive. Issei, leaning on the bus to balance himself, tried to catch his breath. Feeling something in his ear, he patted his ear, water pouring out of it. 10 years later, 17-year-old Issei Hyodo smiled widely as he walked up to the school known as Kuo Academy. Puberty was definitely spared upon him. His body was greatly developed, possessing a muscle-bound physique, and his height had increased, standing at 6 feet 2 inches. His eagerness was taken in opinion when an apathetic female voice laced with indifference spoke. You're acting like such a child, Issei. Issei turned around to see an attractive woman with long dark brown hair, and cool brown eyes. She was dressed in a lime green turtleneck shirt, a dark pink miniskirt, and dark leggings. Issei rested his arms behind his head in excitement. Oh come on, Naomi-chan. You can't tell me you're not excited to be starting our second year. 17-year-old Naomi Rin gave him a cold look. Your idea of excitement is clearly not the same as mine. Issei chuckled, and he gave Naomi a sheepish grin. Ah, lighten up, Issei said as he looked up the sky. Naomi glared at him. One cannot simply lighten up Issei, especially when you are involved. Issei blinked repeatedly, and then he grinned. I shall take that as a compliment, Issei cheerfully said, as he eagerly walked to the Kuo Academy building. Naomi gave him a cold glare, and with a huff, she shook her head in annoyance, following Issei into the school building. Unbeknownst to them, a crimson-haired young woman with a well-endowed figure, peered down at Issei and Naomi, her eyes narrowed in deep concentration. Interesting. Previous ch2 of 13 next. Chapter 3. Remind me again why you're friends with those idiots, Naomi said with a scowl. School had just ended, and Issei and Naomi were walking out of the building, trailing behind the crowd of students. Issei chuckled at his companion's words. Oh come on, Naomi-chan. Issei said, Matsuda and Motohama aren't all that bad once you get to know them. Naomi's response was a scoff. That remains to be seen. Issei just smiled. Then it sure is a good thing that I'm not a pervert like them, huh? He grinned, receiving a glare from Naomi in return. As the two continued their walk across the bridge, Issei looked at the book in Naomi's hands, and he rose an eyebrow in curiosity at the title. Mythology. Naomi looked at the book in her hands, and she nodded. Issei blinked in surprise. I didn't know you liked mythology. Naomi was about to answer, until the pair heard a saccharine voice. Pardon me. Issei and Naomi turned around to see a young woman with long black hair that fell to her hips and bright violet eyes. The girl wore a dark red jacket with the letter P embroidered in gold, a white undershirt, a red bow, and a green skirt with a thin white strip around the lower end of it. She gazed at Issei with a pink blush on her face, shuffling her knees in shyness. Are you Issei Hyodo? Issei blinked in surprise, while Naomi sent the girl a glare. Issei, do you know this girl? Naomi whispered. Issei shook his head in response to her question. Nope, I've never seen her before in my life. He straightened up, and he looked at the girl with a smile. Yep, that's me, and you are. Yuma looked down in shyness. My name is Yuma Amano. I've seen you travel around this bridge a number of times. That's when I realized. Issei shared a mutual eyebrow raise with Naomi as they glanced at each other. Yuma's blush started to deepen as she stuttered. WWOU, would you go out with me? There was absolute silence. Issei's eyes widened in surprise, while Naomi's eyes narrowed in deep suspicion. She looked over to Issei, and saw a bit of uneasiness cross his face. But much to her surprise, his nervous expression morphed into a cheerful smile. Sure, why not? Let's do it. Both of the women gasped in shock. Although their emotions were obviously contrasted, Naomi's was an expression of astonishment, while Yuma's was one of excitement. That's great, she said with a cute and cheerful smile on her face. You just made my day. Naomi glared, and she set her sight to Issei. Issei, what are you? Issei cut her off, flashing her with a mysterious smile on his face, which silenced Naomi quickly. Issei turned to the girl, and his smile widened. How about Sunday? That good for you? Yuma nodded with a warm smile on her face. That sounds great. Issei chuckled, and he waved the girl goodbye, as he walked away from her. Naomi glared in distrust at the girl, before following Issei. As the pair walked away, a sinister smile appeared on Yuma's face. Issei's house. Issei sighed as he walked into his living room, plopping down on his couch, placing his arms behind his head. He noticed a still-standing Naomi shooting him a glare, and he sat up straight to look up at her. Something wrong. Naomi's eyes narrowed. Yes, something's wrong, you baka. Why did you say yes to that Yuma girl? You said yourself that you didn't know her. Issei just gave her a smile, and he clasped his hands together. He chuckled in amusement, tapping his foot. Naomi huffed. What exactly is so funny? Issei looked to her, and his smile grew. What's funny, Naomi-chan, is that I'm onto her little game. Naomi rose an eyebrow. Game. Issei pointed to her. That's right. Yuma and I have never once met one another before. The fact that she asked me on a date, just out of the blue, means that she has some type of ulterior motive. And that ulterior motive is? Issei chuckled. That's the question. I don't know exactly what her motive is, but... His grin grew in size. That's the fun of it, Naomi-chan. It's so exciting. So many different motives. But there's also another thing I realized. Naomi edged him on, prompting Issei to explain further. She wasn't human. Her aura definitely wasn't pure at all. I could sense it. I don't know what she is, but she certainly isn't normal. But that just makes it more interesting. He sent Naomi another smile. Did you notice anything about her blush? Naomi shook her head. What about it? Issei beamed in amusement, and he stood up. With a burst of speed, he rushed over towards Naomi, getting his face way too close to hers. A pink blush formed on Naomi's face, as she gave him a glare. Issei smiled, and he stepped back, clearly finding this situation amusing. "See, Naomi-chan," he began, pointing to the girl. "You just blushed. Against your own will, as a matter of fact. But Yuma, her blush was completely fake." Naomi's eyes widened with shock, as Issei smirked and continued his explanation. She was forcing the blush to appear on her face. She assumed that by acting all cute and innocent, she could successfully swoon me, allowing her to deceive me into going out with her. Issei's grin widened as he turned around, walking back to the couch, with his arms stretched outwardly. But what she didn't count on, was that I'm already ahead of her in her own game. He sat on his couch again, his leg resting on his other leg. "And now I wait." Naomi stared at Issei with an almost nervous look. "You seem way too excited for this, Issei." Issei set his amused eyes towards her, and he smiled. "Of course I am. I'm just waiting to see how this plays out. This Yuma girl obviously wasn't normal. Chances are, something very interesting is going to happen. And when that occurs, I'll be ready." He crossed his arms with a grin. "Oh, this is going to be fun." He turned to the shell-shocked Naomi. "Set your watch, Naomi-chan." He turned to stare at the center of the living room, his smirk widening. The game starts on Sunday. Author's note. One of the reviews stated that in the last chapter, I copied a scene from Man of Steel. In response to that, I have never actually seen the movie at all. So I apologize if it seemed similar, but I had come up with the revelation of Issei's growing powers in my head by myself. So again, sorry if the events in Chapter 2 seem similar to Man of Steel. And another apology. Sorry if this chapter seems too short. I will try to make some longer chapters, and also focus on my other stories. You readers have a good day. Udai 1224, first previous ch3 of 13 next. Chapter 4, Saturday. I still say you're having way too much fun with this, Naomi said with an annoyed tone. Issei turned to her with a curious expression, and then he chuckled. Since it was the weekend, and seeing as they did not have school, Issei and Naomi entertained themselves by walking around the mall. You say that like it's a bad thing, Issei replied. Naomi shook her head and scoffed. I just don't understand why you said yes to her. You could have just said no, and just left it at that. Issei shook his head with a smirk, putting his hands in his pockets. But where's the fun in that? Besides, if Yuma's planning something, which I'm sure she is, it's definitely going to be something interesting. Naomi just sighed and shook her head. Why are we at the mall anyway? Issei smiled. There was this awesome-looking trench coat I saw on one of those clothing commercials. It looked so epic I wanted to get it. So that's why we're here. Naomi raised an eyebrow. A trench coat. The pair stopped at a clothing store and entered it. As he walked around the store, Issei searched for the desired trench coat. He looked in the aisle featuring jackets and coats, and his eyes widened. A grin split his face as he rushed over, with Naomi rolling her eyes and following the eager young man. Naomi's eyes widened at the design. It was a long black trench coat, with shoulder pads as a feature, with the collar flipped up. Issei turned around and smiled at her, pointing at the desired coat. What do you think, Naomi-chan? Naomi narrowed her eyes, and peered closer at the trench coat. Looking for the price tag, she peeled the paper up, and her eyes shot open. Issei, this thing costs $3,000. Issei rose an eyebrow. Oh, is that all? A look of shock came to Naomi's face. What do you mean is that all? Then her eyes narrowed. You're not expecting me to pay for this, are you? Issei blinked in confusion, and then he stifled a chuckle. Of course not. I brought some money. Naomi rose an eyebrow, daring Issei to prove her wrong. There's no way you have that much money on you, she said in firm disbelief. Issei gave her a smirk. Naomi-chan must not know me that well. Naomi rose an eyebrow at his statement. Issei put out his hand, and a whirl of energy emerged. As Naomi looked on in shock, Issei's smile grew, and he closed his hand, the energy fading between his fingers. He opened his hand, and Naomi's eyes shot wide open. A bundle of $100 bills was set in Issei's hands. Naomi shakily pointed to her friend's hand. Is that? Issei grinned. Yep, exactly $3,000. A thought came to him. Oh wait, they'll probably tax it too. Another $100 plopped onto his hand, and he smiled. Yep, that should do it. With a cheerful smile, he hastily grabbed the trench coat, and rushed over to the cashier, leaving the shell-shocked Naomi. Issei's house. After paying for his new coat, and arousing Naomi out her shocked gaze, the pair went all the way back to Issei's house. The two went up to Issei's room, shutting the door behind them, and they sat in their respective seats, Issei in his bed, and Naomi in Issei's desk chair. The pair sat in mutual silence for a minute, until Naomi turned to Issei with a questioning glance. Issei. The young man's reply was a curious look. What? Was that back there? Back at the store. Issei rose an eyebrow in confusion, causing Naomi to roll her eyes. When you made money suddenly appear in your hand. Issei just stared at her for a few seconds, and then he smiled. Naomi-chan, he began. You've known me since we were kids. You know I'm different from others. Frankly, I'm surprised on how shocked you were when I showed you that technique at the store. Naomi just shook her head. I've seen what you can do, Issei. You have super strength, super speed, and from what you showed me earlier, the apparent ability to create anything out of nothingness. Is there any other power you have, or rather, are there more powers? Issei adopted a thoughtful look on his face. He sat up on his bed, crossing his arms in contemplation. Well, aside from what you mentioned, not much that I know of. I can sense an individual's aura, which not only allows me to tell if they're human or not, but it also tells me when they're lying or telling the truth. He looked out towards his window, peering at the sky. He got up from his bed and walked toward his window. Looking at it for a few moments, he turned back to look at Naomi. I can change the weather, when I feel like it. Sometimes if the sky gets too dark, I can change it back to its appearance when it's covered with sunlight. And when it's raining, I can make the rain stop. Naomi looked on in listening intent. I don't really know what other powers I have. They always arose whenever I felt upset about something. He turned to look at Naomi. I've learned to control some of my powers since then, but I can't help the feeling that I have more in my disposal. Naomi stared at Issei quietly. Issei walked back to his bed, sitting softly on it. A look of seriousness was etched on his face. He turned to his companion. Can I tell you something? Naomi blinked, but then she nodded in assent. Issei got comfortable on his bed, and he turned his position towards Naomi. When I was younger, I used to have this really strange dream. First, there would be complete darkness, like it was completely void of anything. Then about 19 giant-like figures would appear. As soon as they appeared, aspects of the world would suddenly just become animated. Mountains, seas of water, the sky, light, darkness, and so many aspects would come to life. Naomi stared in amazement at Issei's description of his dream. But then she noticed Issei's face became slightly downcast, and that he was no longer looking at her, but at the ground. The young man continued his story. I don't know exactly what happened, but then the figures started combating with each other. Every impact each of them endured, a piece of the world began to dissolve away. I could see the natural disasters, the very same ones that newscasters report on. As parts of the world started to fade away, the same 19 giants stopped in their battle. And as I saw them looking around their surroundings, I felt that it wasn't their intention. I think they had realized that their fighting was starting to have destructive effect on the world. Naomi's brown eyes were widened with absolute speechlessness. Issei then looked at her with a serious expression. Then something unusual happened. A pool of auras flowed around the giants. And they started to pull towards each other. In a flash, I had figured out they had combined into one single being. Issei crossed his arms, closing his eyes in thought. I couldn't really make out the appearance of this new figure. But I feel like I'm connected with it. He opened his eyes, revealing a serious yet warm brown color. Next thing I knew, As soon as the figure appeared, the world started to regenerate. It was reforming, and I think it was because that fused being was rejuvenating it. Issei sighed and he laid upon his bed. And that's it. The last thing I see, before the dream ends, is that fused giant turning to the center of the area around it, and it's almost like it's looking at me. Naomi didn't know what to say as she stared at Issei. She cast him a sad look. Is this what Issei feels? What he really thinks about? Is his cheerful yet annoying personality a facade? Naomi's thoughts were cut off as she heard a sigh from Issei. The young man got up from his bed and he gave a sad smile, turning to Naomi. But I guess that's how mystery works, huh, Naomi-chan? There are just some things that I'm not aware of. He paused for a moment, and then his smile became wider. Well, it's a good thing I like finding out new things, right? Naomi stared at Issei for a few moments, and then she smiled. No matter how annoying the young man was, Naomi always preferred a cheerful Issei. It always made her feel warm. Of course, she wouldn't ever admit that to him. Issei would probably never let her forget it. She looked up at Issei, noticing the young man staring at his alarm clock. The time was 5 p.m. He held a mischievous grin on his face. Naomi raised an eyebrow, fighting back an amused smile. Something funny about the time, Issei. Issei shot her that familiar smirk, and he crossed his arms. In just 24 hours, Naomi-chan, the game starts. His smile grew. I'm itching to see what happens. So many things, so many possible events could occur. And the best part about this is, I have a trick up my sleeve. Naomi raised a thin eyebrow and crossed her arms, bringing her leg over the other. And what, pray tell, is this trick? Issei just gave her a chuckle, his brown eyes shining with amusement. Next day, Sunday, Issei, clad in a white long-sleeved button-down open shirt and blue jeans, with the shirt covered by his newly bought black trench coat, looked down at his watch. He stood at a public area, where a series of restaurants, shops, and malls surrounded. Issei, with a bored expression, looked around the area. He then heard a female voice. Aiz-kun. Issei turned to the front, and he smiled. Yuma Amano ran across the street to get to him, and smiled at him warmly. Did I make you wait too long? She asked. Issei shook his head with a smile, raising a hand up in dismissal. Nah, you're good. So are you ready? Yuma nodded, and with that the two wandered off to continue with their date. Their date consisted of going to a restaurant, an ice cream palace, and lastly, a stroll to the park. As they walked together, Issei noticed Yuma had sped her pace, stopping in front of the park fountain. She turned around, smiling sweetly at Issei. Aiz-kun, there's something I want to do to celebrate our first ever date. Will you please hear it? Issei inwardly smirked, and without Yuma noticing, a spark of energy appeared in his palm. The energy faded, and then suddenly Issei's shadow started to move before fading away. Issei pretended to look confused by blinking in surprise, and then he adopted a smile. Sure, Yuma-chan. Go ahead. Yuma walked closer to Issei, with her head bowed. She then looked back up, and clearly says to him, Would you die for me? Issei's eyes shot open, when Yuma's clothing disintegrated, a sign that she began to transform. She grew much taller, taking on a more mature physique, and her eyes changed, taking on a menacing, more evil look. Her clothing now consisted of black, strap-like objects, around and under her breasts, a thong-like piece held around her hips by 3 thin straps, gloves that ran right up her arms with small lengths of chains hanging from them, shoulder guard-like objects on her shoulders with 3 large spikes sprouting from her right shoulder, and black thigh-high heel boots. A pair of black wings sprouted from her back. Issei looked in shock, and his eyes widened further when a vibrating sound began to reach his ears. Yuma was charging a fuchsia-purple spear of light, and directed it at Issei. As she looked upon the shocked boy, she smirked. Please die for me, and with that she thrust the light spear forward, intending to stab Issei. However, Yuma failed to notice Issei's fearful expression slowly, but surely, morphing into a downright mischievous smirk. As soon as the light spear came in contact with Issei, it immediately disintegrated. What? If one were to see Yuma's face right now, they would have collapsed in pure hilarity. Yuma's violet eyes widened to the size of softballs, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. No, that should have killed him. It dissolved like it was nothing to him. She looked up, and felt an immediate chill in her spine. Issei held a smile bordering on complete cheekiness. I win, Yuma-chan. With a single blink of Issei's eye, Yuma was suddenly blown away from a powerful invisible force. Issei smiled as he released a huge surge of energy from his body. Yuma crashed into the park fountain, getting drenched from the water, and rubbing her sore head. As she coughed water out of her throat, she looked at Issei in shock. What in the hell is going on? You should be dead right now. Issei's smile grew as he pointed to Yuma. What's going on, Yuma-chan? Is that I beat you at your own game? Yuma gave him a confused yet horrified expression, prompting Issei to explain himself, albeit with a smirk. I knew something was up when you came to me and Naomi at the bridge on Friday. I admit I was a little taken aback on how well you could pull off the innocent and dainty girl act. But you made some mistakes. He lifted up one finger. 1. You forced your blush. I've seen a whole number of girls at my school blush, and I can tell you right now, they're genuine. Yours on the other hand wasn't real at all. I could sense your body temperature, and it was nowhere near the point when a person blushes. He held up a second finger, his smirk growing wider. 2. You asked me out on a date. You and I, up until this point, have never met one another before. And believe me, I would have remembered your face, if we had known each other previously. Now, when you had asked me to go on a date with you, I tried to imagine a couple of possibilities on why a girl who I have never met before in my life would ask me out. There was so many possibilities and outcomes to think of, I couldn't choose which one. His smirk grew even more wider, sending an even profound chill up Yuma's spine. He held up a third finger. And that's when I found it. Your name, Yuma Amano. When it's in a correct order, your name means heaven's evening days. How fitting. He looked up at the sky and smiled. Don't you agree, Issei? Yuma's eyes widened with confusion. Issei, what is he talking about? Wait, is this not him? To her horror, she heard another voice make itself known. As a matter of fact, Kuron, it does sound fitting. Yuma looked up in horror to see the original Issei hovering down towards the two, before setting his feet on the ground next to his clone. Yuma shook with absolute shock. What in the hell is going on? Both Issei and his clone winced at the woman's piercing scream. Then the original Issei smiled. You didn't see that coming, did you, Yuma-chan? Yuma looked back and forth between the two Isseis. I don't understand. Issei smirked, and looked to his clone. It's simple. Before you attempted to kill me, I created a clone in my place, in order to see what would happen as the end result. Since you weren't looking at me directly, you didn't notice me charging my energy. And I got a good result. I gotta say, Kuron, you did a good job. The Issei clone grinned, pleased with his creator's praise, and he faded away into pools of energy, before being reabsorbed into Issei. Feeling his energy returning, Issei turned to look Yuma in the eyes, before flashing her a leered smirk. Now there's just one thing left, Issei said as he walked closer to Yuma, who was still in the park fountain. The girl shook in fear, afraid of what Issei was going to do. Issei's smirk grew. The reason you tried to kill me in the first place. Yuma shook in absolute terror, and Issei, with a smirk, released a vast surge of energy, causing Yuma to gulp sharply. At Issei's house, Naomi sat worryingly in Issei's living room, glancing at the clock ever so frequently. She looked at the house phone, contemplating whether or not to call Issei. Her nervousness rising, she reached up to grab the phone, and was stopped when she heard the doorbell ring. Blinking in surprise, she got up to answer it. Naomi opened the door, and was ready to greet the person, before her instincts took over. She ducked just in time as a large object flew just above her. She winced when she heard the object crash into the wall with a thud. Naomi turned around quickly to see the cracked wall, and a young woman with black hair and violet eyes. Her eyes widened in shock as she recognized her. Is that Yuma? Naomi had noticed something different about the girl. She noted Yuma was now taller, and she was dressed in a revealing S&M sort of outfit, and she possessed what appeared to be black wings. She jumped when she heard a chuckle from outside. "Looks like we've got company." Immediately recognizing the voice, Naomi turned around, her brown eyes widening in astonishment at the source of the voice. From outside, Issei smirked as he put his hands in his pockets. With a delighted air about him, he looked at the groaning Yuma sliding down the wall. Chuckling in amusement, Issei turned back to look at the shell-shocked Naomi. His smile widened at her face. What a way to start a greeting, eh, Naomi-chan? Note: Kuron means clone in Japanese. First previous ch4 of 13 next. Chapter 5. At the Occult Research Club. A buxom young woman with long crimson-red hair and blue-green eyes sat at her desk with a thoughtful expression on her face. She was contemplating on a certain person that had been on her mind since the start of the second year of Kuo Academy. Issei Hyodo. The club door opened, revealing a buxom young woman with long black hair and violet eyes. Her hair was tied in a long ponytail, with an orange ribbon keeping it in place. With a smile on her face, she walked over to the crimson-haired girl, holding out a cup of tea. "Would you like some tea, Rias?" Rias Gramori looked up at the girl, and she smiled. Reaching for the cup of tea, she sipped it with a satisfied air. "Arigato, Akano." Akano Himahima smiled warmly, her smile fading slightly at the thoughtful look on Rias' face. "Something on your mind?" Rias gave her a look. "I." She was cut off, when a surge of immense energy passed through the air around them. The two girls' eyes widened in shock. Rias' fist tightened in slight fear. What was that just now? That colossal amount of energy. Akano started to giggle. Era, what frightening power. At Issei's house. Issei walked into his house, closing the door behind him with an amused smirk. He turned to the still shocked Naomi and he smiled. He then looked to the groaning Yuma collapsed on the floor. "Need a little help there, Yuma-chan." Hearing her alias, Yuma immediately stiffened, sitting up straight and crawling back to the dented wall. Naomi rose an eyebrow at the expression on Yuma's face, and she turned to look at Issei. "What happened to her appearance? And what did you do to her?" Issei's response was a raised eyebrow, but then he smiled. "I told you she wasn't human, Naomi-chan. And to answer your second question, I did absolutely nothing." Naomi narrowed her eyes. She flew across the house and almost embedded herself into the wall. "That means you had to have thrown her." Issei chuckled. "Actually, I only blinked." Naomi's eyes widened. "You blinked." Out of nowhere, a fuchsia light spear came in contact with Issei, before disintegrating once again. There was silence. Very slow in his movement, Issei turned around to see the horrified Yuma, shaking with absolute terror, shocked that her second attempt didn't work. Instead of being angry, Issei smirked with amusement. "If it didn't work on my clone, whatever gave you the idea that it was going to work against me?" he said with a chuckle. Yuma gasped, and she shook harder in fright. Issei turned to Naomi, and his smile grew. "They never learn, do they, Naomi-chan?" Naomi's response was a slight scowl, but then it softened.
Issei chuckled, and he set his sights to Yuma. He walked towards her, and he bent down on one leg. Yuma stiffened, and she set her eyes down, refusing to meet eye contact with Issei. "Please. Don't." Issei tilted his head, and he chuckled again. "I don't understand why you're begging. If anything, you don't deserve the right to beg. After all, you did lie to me. And to add insult to attempted injury, you tried to kill me, twice." Yuma was silent, refusing to meet Issei's eyes. With a satisfied smirk, Issei stood back up and he snapped his fingers. In an instant, Yuma felt an unfamiliar sensation in her body. She tried to move, but found that she couldn't. Shock greatly turning into fear, she could only grunt in surprise. Naomi rose an eyebrow, turning to Issei with a curious look. Issei turned to her. "In case you were wondering, I rendered our guest completely immobile. The only things she can use are her mouth and head." He turned over to Yuma, and his smirk grew. "I think it's about time you answer a few questions of mine." Yuma grunted, trying in vain to resist Issei's paralysis, but soon she gave up the attempt. With a despondent, saddened expression, she nodded to him. Issei crossed his arms. "All right, first off, what's your real name?" Yuma gulped. Issei gave her an almost sadistic smirk. And remember, I will know if you're lying. So I see no need for you to drag this out any longer by your lack of integrity. Yuma looked about ready to protest, but then she looked down. Reynal, she said quietly. Issei smiled. Now that wasn't so hard. Alright, second question. There's no doubt you aren't human. What with the black wings and all? So, what are you anyway? Reynal tried to move again, but to no avail. A fallen angel. This time Naomi looked on in surprise. Fallen angel? You mean, they actually exist? Issei chuckled. For some reason, that doesn't surprise me. You are no angel, that's for sure. He chuckled again, shaking in mirth, with Reynal sending him a dark glare in return. Issei's laughter eventually subsided, and he pointed to her. My third and final question. In a burst of speed, Issei teleported, and reappeared in front of Reynal, shocking the girl instantly. With a smirk, he asked. Why did you try to kill me? As far as I'm concerned, I have done nothing to you. So it couldn't have been a situation of you just holding a grudge towards me. With a thoughtful look, Issei teleported back to where he was standing previously. So it can't be an old grudge. A possible reason could be that I was predicted as a threat to your kind or something. Reynal's eyes widened, but she quickly looked down when Issei looked towards her. But Issei had already noticed, and he smiled. I'm right, aren't I, Reynal? Reynal's eyes widened with shock. How did he do that? The fallen angel looked up at Issei, and she sighed. I was sent here. I was sent to observe you, to keep a close eye on you. To make sure your sacred gear wouldn't go out of control. Issei's smile fell, and an expression of curiosity formed on his face. He shared a mutual glance with the equally shocked Naomi. Sacred gear? Reynal nodded, and explained further. I was supposed to watch you, in order to make sure your sacred gear remained dormant. Issei blinked in shock, and then his familiar smirk arose. And yet you disobeyed your orders, and acted on your own accord. A smile formed on his face as he turned to Naomi. How about that, Naomi-chan? Naomi turned to him with a confused expression. Issei smiled as he elaborated for her. The fact that Reynal wanted to kill me so badly could only mean that this so-called sacred gear of mine must be unbelievably strong. He chuckled. It seems I was right. I apparently do have a lot more power in my disposal than I expected. The occupants in Issei's house were still in absolute silence, until a ringtone went off. Both Issei and Naomi blinked in confusion, and the former looked down. Realizing the noise was coming from Reynal, he smirked. Now who could be calling you? Reynal's eyes widened, and she started to sweat in anxiety. Issei walked over to her, and bent down, reaching for the fallen angel's pink cell phone. He flipped the phone open, and pressed a green button. He pressed the speaker button, and the three occupants remained quiet just in time to hear a male voice. Reynal? Pick up already. Are you there? Issei looked to Reynal, and his smirk widened. He covered the phone with his hand. Ask who it is. This should be interesting. He held up the cell phone to Reynal's mouth, allowing her to speak. With a nervous gulp, Reynal spoke. Why yeah. Who is this? What do you mean who is this? It's Donasek. So did you kill that brat with the sacred gear yet? Ignoring the other fallen angel's insult towards him, Issei's smirk positively grew more wider. Naomi glared harshly at the phone, inwardly cursing at the man. Deciding it was time to make himself known, Issei moved the phone away from Reynal's mouth. Hello, Donasek. There was a long pause. Who the hell is this? Issei chuckled. Well, according to you, the brat with the sacred gear. Another pause. Then another voice made itself known. A arrogant and seductive feminine voice. Donasek. Who is it? Quiet Calawarner. Then another voice made itself known. A joyful, upbeat, and childish female voice. Hey, don't say that, you big jerk. Issei chuckled as he heard Donasek growl in annoyance. You too, middled. Now listen up, brat. Where is Reynal? What did you do to her? Issei chuckled again with mirth. So the four of you were in this whole situation together, huh? What a coincidence. Oh, and Reynal's all safe and sound. Don't worry, hurting women isn't really my style. I haven't done anything to Reynal. In fact, She was the instigator in this little personal conflict of ours. I had nothing to do with it. He heard Donasik growl on the other line. You stupid brat. Issei ignored him and pressed the end button. His eyes widened as he felt two sources of energy. He noted the energy wasn't the same as Reynolds. With a smile, he turned to look at Naomi. Naomi-chan. I would move if I were you. Naomi rose an eyebrow in confusion, and she looked down just in time to see a bright crimson circle appear from under her. With a yelp in surprise, she sidestepped towards Issei. With a chuckle of amusement, Issei looked on as the crimson circle emitted two pools of energy, which formed into two well-endowed young women. Naomi's eyes widened, remembering that she had seen the two women at school before. The two great ladies, Rias Gremory and Akeno Hamejima. Both Rias and Akeno gave the girl a smile, before turning to look at Issei and Reynal. Rias smirked at the cowering fallen angel. Reynal was more terrified than before. First Issei, and now them. They're nowhere near Issei's level, but that doesn't exactly reassure me. Issei Hyodo. You really are an interesting one. Issei grinned. Thanks for the compliment, Gremory-senpai. He sat up, and put his hands in his pockets. So what are you doing here, anyway? Rias put her hand on her hip. I sensed a fallen angel nearby, and I decided to investigate. She looked into Issei's eyes. I also sensed your energy, Aiz-kun. Issei blinked, but then he smiled at her. So that's why you're here, huh? He crossed his arms. Well, Reynal over here is incapacitated as we speak. If you want, you can do whatever you want with her. I'm done with my questions. Her eyes widening in shock, Reynal began to gasp repeatedly. She'd rather be stuck with Issei than to have to be at the merciful hands of Rias Gremory. But much to her shock and surprise, Rias dismissed the notion with a wave of her hand. There's no need, Aiz-kun. Besides, I'm quite sure you have other uses for her. Issei, with a thoughtful expression, turned to look back at Reynal. The only sign of her terror was that her head was shaking. Staring at her for a moment, Issei smirked, and turned to look back at amused Rias. Sure. Why not? I could use someone to help me around the house. Naomi's eyes widened in surprise, and she grabbed Issei's ear. It didn't hurt Issei, but he could feel it, and he grinned at his companion. Something wrong, Naomi-chan. Naomi narrowed her brown eyes darkly, and she gripped harder on Issei's ear. You baka. Why are you letting her stay here? After everything she tried to do to you. She tried to kill you for God's sake. Issei only smiled, and he moved away from the irritated Naomi. Relax, Naomi-chan. Relax. Issei chuckled sheepishly, and he rubbed his head. Rias looked on in amusement, while Akeno giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. Issei then stopped in his chuckles, gaining a curious look in his eyes. He then turned back to Reynal, and gave her another trademark smirk. His smirk brought a chill to Reynal's spine, and the fallen angel shivered. Issei set his gaze to Naomi, Rias, and Akeno. You ladies stay right here. I'll be back. Naomi rose an eyebrow in confusion, and she tried to ask Issei what he was going to do, but she was too late as Issei quickly transmitted away from the room. The four girls stared in shock. Naomi crossed her arms. Where did he go? At the park, three figures stood next to each other, each with mutual impatient expression. There was only a man and two women. The man had short black hair and dark blue eyes. He was clad in a pale violet trench coat over a white dress shirt with a matching ascot, black pants and shoes, and a black fedora. Fallen angel Donasik looked about ready to crush the phone in his hands. That brat dared to hang up on him? The woman next to him scoffed. She was a tall and buxom woman with long, navy blue hair, and golden brown eyes. She was clad in a violet, trench coat-like top with a wide collar, a matching miniskirt, and black-heeled shoes. She also wore a gold necklace around her neck. Fallen angel Calawarner narrowed her eyes as she grabbed the phone from Donasik's hands. Then a smaller hand went to reach for the phone. Come on, Calawarner. Let me see it. Calawarner narrowed her eyes at the girl. The girl had blonde hair styled in twin short-side ponytails and blue eyes. She was dressed in a black Lolita dress with white frills, a large black bow on the front, and a green jewel embedded on the collar, white thigh-high socks, and black shoes. She also wore a large black bow on top of her hair. Fallen Angel Middle grinned as she successfully claimed the phone. Yes. Smiling in glee, she ignored the dark glares from her comrades. Donasek growled. How dare that spineless brat hang up on me? He was cut off when Calawarner gave him a sharp glare. For Pete's sake, shut the hell up already. Middle put in her unnecessary 2 cents. Yeah, no need to act like such a baby, Donasek. Donasek looked about ready to stab the both of them with his light spear, until he heard a familiar voice. So you're the other fallen angels. The three turned to see a young man with brown hair and light brown eyes. He possessed a muscular physique, clad in a white long-sleeved t-shirt, blue jeans, black shoes, and a long black trench coat that billowed outwardly. He gave the three fallen angels a smirk. As soon as they had seen him, the three charged their light spears, blue from Donasek, yellow from Calawarner, and pink from Middle, respectively. Issei's smirk grew. Oh, this is going to be great. The three fallen angels threw their light spears simultaneously, intending to stab Issei. Issei just stood still. The result was the same as Reynald's attempts. As soon as the light spears touched Issei, they shattered into nothingness. Donasek was the first to react, while his female comrades looked on in absolute shock. What the hell? His smirk widening, Issei held up a hand, an energy sphere appearing on his palm. He threw it towards Donasek, with the energy sphere being absorbed into the fallen angel's body. The fallen angel, understandably shocked, looked at Issei in rage. What the hell are you doing? With his hand outstretched, Issei's smile grew wider, and he closed his hand into a fist. Before Donasek could react, his body began to expand, and then the fallen angel exploded, his wings floating away where he once stood. It was at that moment that Calawarner and Middle began to realize that they really should have thought this through about working with Reynald. With that in their thoughts, the two fallen angels began to fly away. With a snap of his fingers, Issei caught the two women in a large sphere, trapping the two of them. They struggled to get out, indicated by them thrashing around in the energy sphere. Issei chuckled, placing his hands in his pockets. Looks like I have more helpers around the house. Shame that Donasek couldn't join. He shrugged his shoulders, dismissing the thought. Ah well. He looked back up at the two fallen angels with a toothy grin. Calawarner and Middle gulped in fear. At Issei's house, so, what do you find so interesting about Issei? Asked Naomi. She, Rias, and Akano were settled down onto the couch, drinking tea, and having a civil conversation. Rias smiled. He's very extraordinary. A remarkable one. Naomi blinked at her, and she looked down at her tea. She smiled. He's exceptional. I should know. I've known him since we were kids. There was always something special about him. Rias gave her a smirk. The fact that he has superpowers, or the way he carries himself. Naomi's smile grew warmer. Both. Rias turned to Akano, the latter giving her a mutual smile. That's a nice thing to say. Naomi-chan. Naomi jumped in shock, and she turned around to see Issei smiling at her. But then her eyes trailed to the other women behind him. They appeared to be encased in energy spheres. Reynald looked on in shock at her trapped comrades. Calawarner. Middle. The two named fallen angels turned to see Reynald, and their immediate reaction was a dark glare. Middle spoke first. You stupid big idiot. Issei rolled his eyes, and with a snap of his fingers, Middle's voice cancelled out. The tiny fallen angel didn't realize that even though she was clearly screaming her tiny lungs out, her voice could no longer be heard. Issei smiled in satisfaction. Ah, that's better. Issei? The young man turned around to see a glowering Naomi clenching her fists. Who the hell are they? Issei just smiled, and gave her a thumbs up. More volunteers to help around the house. In return, Naomi conked Issei upside the head. Akano giggled at the sight. Era. What a cute kohai. Rias smiled, eyes coon. Hearing his name, Issei turned to look at her. I have a request for you. Would you come with Akano and I to another location? There is something we must discuss with you. Issei blinked in confusion, and he put a hand under his chin. Then he smiled. Sure. I'll go with you. He turned to look at Naomi, and his smile widened. Well, see ya Naomi-chan. I'll be back later. He was about to walk away, until he felt a grip on his trench coat. He turned around to see a glaring Naomi. You are not leaving me with these fallen angels all by myself. Issei rose an eyebrow. Why not? They won't do anything to you. Naomi narrowed her eyes. You don't know that. Your paralysis and that energy shield could fade away as soon as you leave. With a smirk, Issei snatched his trench coat out of Naomi's grip. Relax, Naomi-chan. With a momentary thoughtful look on his face, Issei crossed his arms. His eyes then widened. I've got it. Naomi rose an eyebrow. Issei held up his hand, the energy forming in his palm. He closed his hand, allowing his shadow from under him to move. The shadow, combined with Issei's energy, formed into a clone. Her eyes widened in shock. Naomi stepped back. Issei smiled. See, Naomi-chan. Problem solved. Karun here will keep the fallen angels trapped, so you'll be safe. Naomi stuttered for a bit, before that familiar cold gaze formed on her face. Fine. She narrowed her eyes at the Issei clone, who smiled back in return. Happy that Naomi was, barely but surely, satisfied, Issei turned to look back at Rias and Akeno, and placed his hands in his pockets, a feeling of excitement rushing through him. Well, Gremory-senpai, Hamejima-senpai, he crossed his arms as he smirked. Lead the way. Author's note. An alternate idea came to me in this story. I was thinking I could perhaps give Issei a different sacred gear. It's hard to think about it, because Diedrich is my other favorite character in the DxD series. So now I'm balancing between giving Issei the boosted gear, or supplying him with a different one. So you readers feel free to give your suggestions. I'm not devising a poll or anything, I just want to hear what you readers think. If you want to, of course. I'm going to decide on the sacred gear eventually. You readers have a good night. Udai 1224, first, previous ch5 of 13 next.